Hello, my name is Kevin Whalen, and I teach in history and Native American and Indigenous studies at the University of Minnesota Morse. I want to again thank Karen Ho for her generous invitation to participate, and Sarah Cronquist for all of her hard work, and David Lemke for thinking of including the Morris campus and its history in this important conversation. Thanks to all of you for being here. You know, I'll just say this: I think it's a special kind of person who stays until the last panel, and I've seen a lot of these faces throughout the entire 2 days, so I'm glad you all are here. So yesterday I gave a brief reflection on the origins of our campus at UMM as a Catholic and then later a federal Indian boarding school. I focused especially on the question of whether the concept of reparations might be useful for framing UMM's commitments to Indigenous students, given our unique campus history. And I argued that ideas around sovereignty and the fulfillment of treaty obligations should underlie our continued commitment to educating Indigenous students free of tuition. Today I'm going to talk a little bit more on that topic, and then Becca Gercken, my colleague from Native American and Indigenous Studies, and I will turn our attention to the challenges and opportunities that come with teaching Indigenous students, teaching Indigenous studies to mostly Native students on the site of what once was a boarding school. So I'm going to begin with a brief history of our campus, and I'll focus especially on the boarding school era between 1887 and 1909. I'll talk through some of the problems and opportunities around how our campus frames and sometimes fails to frame its boarding school past amid its very indigenous present. Finally, I'll talk briefly, Becca Gercken will talk in more length about the process of using archival and curricular projects to create more dialogue around our campus history among both Native and non-Native students, staff, and faculty members. And along these lines, we'll discuss our co-taught course that's centered on UMM's campus history. Okay, as promised, some brief details about the history of UMM. The institution began its life as a Catholic boarding school for Native people in 1887. It was run on federal contract money by the Sisters of Mercy, a Catholic order. We have frustratingly few records about this time period, mostly just written correspondences between a woman named Sister Mary Joseph Lynch, who ran the school, and officials from the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions. What we do know is that the school operated at a capacity of roughly 100 students for about a decade after its opening. Students and employees struggled to farm enough food for the school, and they received less than adequate funding from the federal government, which was the case at every boarding school, Catholic or federal. We don't have a lot of info on student experiences. We have some, but we know far more about what the nuns thought about and taught about at the school. And Becca will talk a bit more about the challenges of these archival restrictions within the context of teaching an archivally based course. So I'll turn just briefly to this photo. I believe this photo is from 1889. The students you can see here, although they're not real well defined, we know that most of these students came from Turtle Mountain to the school at Morris. And the woman with the sort of clearly defined habit on the right is Sister Mary Joseph Lynch. In 1896, the federal government canceled its contract with the Sisters of Mercy and took over operation of the school at Morris. This owed in large part to a rise in anti-immigration and anti-Catholic sentiment within the federal government and broader United States society and culture, especially in Congress. Local citizens in Morris welcomed increased federal presence, as was often the case with these boarding schools, because they believed it would bring lots and lots of money to their community. At this point, the federal government began replacing the clapboard structures you see here with brick buildings. like this one. This is the boys' dormitory from the Federal Indian School period. It's the last surviving building from that campus. On our campus today, it currently houses our multi-ethnic resource center. By the turn of the 20th century, the school had doubled its enrollment to over 200 students, again, mostly from Turtle Mountain and White Earth. The school's curriculum mirrored broader patterns in boarding school education in the United States. As Patty Lowe mentioned yesterday, the curriculum at this school reflected low intellectual expectations for Indigenous students, and it aimed to funnel them into low-wage work. Again, there are frustratingly few records about the federal period at Morse, which is a shame given that most federal Indian boarding schools have far more voluminous records in the National Archives. We're working on trying to dig up more, but having trouble still. Some of the few records that survive in the federal archives have to do with the more negative aspects of the boarding school experience at Morse. School officials kept students from visiting home for years at a time, contributing to loss of language and culture, and to deep disruption of family lives. A superintendent of the school named William Johnson was investigated and eventually fired in 1901 for sexual assault against students and fellow employees. During the course of the investigation of Johnson, it was found that he had also punished students by locking them in padlocks and chains, feeding them restricted diets of bread and water for up to a week at a time. And Becca is going to talk more about that history in the context of our course. Okay, so around the turn of the 20th century, reformers and muckrakers argued that the schools were ineffective at assimilating Native people. After all, tribal communities still existed a full 3 decades after boarding schools were supposed to quickly erase them. Moreover, these schools exposed Native communities to very real suffering. Politicians and newspapers called for the shutdown of the 25 off-reservation boarding schools as they were costly and ineffective in their goals. Morse was one of the first 5 off-reservation boarding schools to close its doors, and that happened in 1909. In 1910, the federal government transferred the school property to the state of Minnesota, and shortly thereafter, the state opened an agricultural high school that operated there until 1960, when it became the University of Minnesota Morris. So 2 bills, one state and one federal, facilitated this transfer. Both of these bills mandated that for as long as the Morris campus operates in an educational capacity, it is required to admit qualified Native students free of charge for tuition. I think this brings up an important question. Why did they do that? I think it was likely a way to assuage a few remaining congressional Republicans concerned with Indian affairs, and just as importantly, I'd argue that many lawmakers, certainly at the state level, simply assumed that Indigenous communities would not exist for much longer, and that it would not represent a significant cost commitment. Native communities are still here, of course, and so the tuition waiver still stands. UMM honors its legal obligations by admitting students enrolled in federally recognized tribes and descendants of enrollees free of tuition, and I should also mention that this tuition waiver stands also for enrolled members of First Nations in Canada and their descendants. I attended UMM as a non-Native student a decade ago. At that time, the student population was about 10% Native students. Today, that number is closer to a quarter of our 1,700 or so students. Okay, so I want to talk through the sort of framing, how we think about and talk about the tuition waiver on our campus. And framing our institution's commitment to Indigenous students and their communities has been complicated. On the one hand, UMM is not the boarding school that once occupied its grounds. On the other, dispossession and attempted genocide are woven into the spaces where we live and learn and work each day and that matters a lot when our student population is a quarter Native, right? Moreover, we are directly linked to the boarding school via the legislation that extends the tuition waiver for Native students down to the current day. So how do we situate ourselves with relation to this commitment? I would argue that the campus tends to frame the tuition waiver in two ways. First, the waiver is often presented as sort of part of a larger commitment to diversity, and it's placed alongside other efforts to support students of color, first-generation college students, and LGBTIAS+ students. Second, the waiver is often presented as part of a narrative about kind of linear progress. That is to say, the boarding school that once functioned on the campus at UMM and that sought to erase indigenous languages, cultures, and identities, or the boarding school once did that, and now UMM works to celebrate and support indigenous languages, cultures, indigenous sovereignty through our curriculum and through administrative support for our Native students. By contextualizing our campus's history and the tuition waiver in these ways, I think we tend to present the waiver very much as a form of reparation that is deeply connected to the legacy of our place. In other words, a wrong was once done here, and we're working to undo it. This can be a good thing, of course, and my colleague Becca, Gercken, and I are certainly committed to the work of bringing to light and addressing the dispossession and cultural erasure that rests at the core of our campus's history, and of placing Native languages, cultures, and histories at the center of our curriculum and increasingly near the center of our institutional identity. But I want to harken back here to a theme I raised yesterday, and that's that framing the tuition waiver solely in terms of reparations or redress runs the risk of obscuring the state and federal laws that mandate the waiver, and more importantly, we run the risk of obscuring the treaty-related obligations around education that were transferred from the boarding school to the agricultural school and then to us via state and federal legislation. While there is a moral component to the work we do for and with our Indigenous students, waiver-related or otherwise, there is also a legal obligation to do so. My hesitancy about these progress narratives also rests in part within misconceptions about the tuition waiver that bubble to the surface at UMM almost daily. And I don't want to say that this represents all students at UMM, which I feel like I may have done yesterday, but there is this relatively common sort of gripe among non-Native students, and it goes something like this, right? We give Native people health care, we give them money, and now we give them a quote-unquote free education, right? When have we given enough? And there's also a very real tendency to look around at Native students and say, well, they seem to be doing fine, right? And what do they need free education for? And again, free in quotes, right? So in this reasoning, which I think relates back to some of the rhetorics about progress that swirl around our campus, right? In this rhetoric and in this reasoning, the very kind of progress that our institution claims to be a part of, or the progress that we claim to drive, can become the very reason to eliminate the programs that have helped to foster that progress. And here I'm talking again about the waiver, right? Finally, one thing I'll mention that's that I'm not going to talk much about because I need to hand over the microphone. We struggle a little bit with, and we're working on how to better represent our boarding school past within the space of the campus, right? For a long time, this plaque was, pretty much it as far as how we represented our campus history, right? And I'll let you read that for yourselves, but you can see that that would be a problematic sort of way to just leave off as far as that history. And so Becca is going to talk a little bit more about kind of how we're working to better represent that history within the context of the space of our campus and the curriculum as well. So I'll welcome her to the podium at this point. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Shiu Dagwado Becca Gercken, Tsitalagi. Hello, my name is Becca Gercken. I teach in English and Native American and Indigenous Studies, or NAIS, at UMM, where in 2005 I co-founded the NAIS program with 2 colleagues. I'd like to thank David Lemke for thinking to invite us today, and also echo Kevin's thanks for the work and support of Karen and Sarah. And I'd like to say how especially appreciative of the openness and the willingness to have conversation that I've encountered here. I spent last weekend at another Big Ten school that shall remain nameless at an Ethnic Voices conference where I was sternly and loudly lectured by a European scholar about how I should be grateful for colonization, and I really needed to start thanking my colonizers, which is not on my agenda anytime soon. So instead, I'm here talking with you all, which has been very great. So for all the reasons Kevin just gave, I think a lot about what it means for me as an Indigenous person to teach at UMM. I also think a lot about what it's like for my students to learn about Native American studies on a campus with our history. In a typical Native Studies class at UMM, half the students are Indigenous, while the other half are American or Americans of European descent. Most of our American students have no background in Indigenous histories and cultures. For example, 95% of my Minnesota students were not taught about the Dakota War of 1862. They have absolutely no understanding of why there are so many more Anishinaabe in this state than there are Dakota. So, and many of our Native students have a similar deficit. While the other half have tribal knowledge, maybe they have regional Indigenous knowledge, but they don't have any strong sense of Indigenous histories beyond their own communities. This combination of UMM's history and demography changes the calculus in our classrooms and in our curriculum. Historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, cultural loss, language loss, blood and place-based identity politics, these are not abstract or theoretical concepts for our Native students. And as our American students come to grips with our place, the site of an Indian residential school, they too move away from an abstract and theoretical engagement with the core questions of Native studies. All of our students, regardless of background or previous knowledge, face the same question. In a place founded to destroy Native cultures, how do students locate themselves in the Native studies conversation? For me and for Kevin, we can start to answer that question through our pedagogy and our curriculum, both of which we understand as a process of reconciliation. The concept of reconciliation, the R that's missing from our symposium's title, but that I think can be a valuable addition to it, is central to many of the conversations in and beyond academia about Indigenous issues. For me, its value lies in the notion of an ongoing process. Reparations and repatriation seem more finite to me. It's a one-to-one exchange or a return. In contrast, reconciliation demands ongoing work from both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, or from the dominant society and minority society. UMM's Native Studies curriculum recognizes the cultural diversity of Indigenous people, foregrounds their agency, and emphasizes the vitality of contemporary Native life. I talk to my students early and often about the authority of experience and its limitations. I explain that having a cultural background that matches the material we're covering does not mean that you have a greater right or responsibility to speak or a greater understanding of the material. I also talk about the anxiety of experience, the tension that non-Indians or Indians raised in a non-traditional setting may feel in class. We also discuss what it means to feel implicated in the settler colonial apparatus that caused so much harm to so many people. UMM offers classes in Native literature and history, world Indigenous literature and film, Anishinaabe-Moan, representations of Indians in popular and academic culture, American Indian song and dance, Indian education, ethnography, etc. It's an especially impressive list when you know that we have only 2 tenure-track faculty members in NAIS at Morse. So, what I'd like to talk about in some detail today is the field school course Kevin already mentioned that we taught last summer. I chose this course because it exemplifies the goals we have as a program and also highlights some of the challenges we face in academia that I think this symposium is working to address. Our class was called Indian Education, Past and Present. Here's a description from the syllabus. This course will examine Indigenous education in the United States and Canada from pre-contact to the late 20th century. Topics covered will include Indigenous ways of teaching and learning, efforts to assimilate Native peoples through education, the movement towards educational self-determination in Native communities, and contemporary representations of boarding school experiences. Students will also gain insight into the Morse Indian School and its contemporary representation at UMM. We face some challenges in this class, as Kevin has already indicated. Our archival materials are not extensive and they are devoid of Native voices. 7 of our 10 students were Native and thus were processing their communities and families' historical and intergenerational trauma by participating in the class. And there was administrative tension and anxiety accompanying our field school research project as we sought, with administrative approval, I want to stress, to transform how we tell our UMM story. We know what our students learned in this course, Kevin and I know, but more important for our discussion today is what we learned from our students as we witnessed their tenacity and resilience in doing this painful and harrowing, if rewarding, work. Students are strong enough to do this work. We need to be brave enough to do it with them. One of our findings in particular illuminates the resolve of our students, our discovery that a dungeon was used during the boarding school period, and that it was located in a building still in use on our campus. Through their archival work, students learned that one of the superintendents was fired when the BIA learned that he had a dungeon in which he confined students as punishment. One student who had refused to tell the superintendent how he'd gotten some liquor was chained by the hands and wrists in the dungeon for 8 days, with only blankets on the floor to sit and sleep on and only tea and bread to drink. He lost 16 pounds in those 8 days. The archives contained a detailed description of the dungeon, down to the room measurements, as well as geographical information about its location on campus. Because our students had already done mapping of the Catholic and federal buildings in relation to our current campus structures, they knew the dungeon had to be in what was once the boys' dormitory and is now the Multi-Ethnic Resource Center, the building that Kevin showed y'all a picture of. So the students went into the basement and they started measuring. And they realized that one room, which currently serves as a student resource space, exactly matches the dungeon's measurements. There was a lot of smudging. We smudged our students, we smudged the space, we smudged the entrances to the building, we left tobacco offerings. But our students did not shy away from this work, and neither has our administration or COPLAC, the Council of Public Liberal Arts Colleges, and the Teagle Foundation, which funded our summer field school. The administration was interested and engaged enough with the work our students did and is so committed to reconciliation that it approved our students continuing their archival work in order to revise and expand the physical documentation of our boarding school history on campus. So they're actually letting our students come up with ideas to create new exhibits and displays and signage across our campus. COPLAC and Teagle were so pleased that they funded a fall digital workshop in Native Studies for these same students, providing money for us to digitize and transcribe our archival materials, which will make them available not only to our students, but to the Indigenous communities whose children were forced to go to the school. They bought a server space, they're committed to maintaining the sites, and they funded a second summer field school, which will continue our archival work and expand the project to include a ground-penetrating radar analysis of our campus, which makes some people really nervous, but it'll be okay. So pulling back a little bit, Preparing for this symposium prompted me to think about reconciliation in curricular and pedagogical contexts, and what remaining resistance there is in Western academia to a reconciliatory curriculum. For me, the resistance or pushback comes down to two things: the call for activist, community-centered research in NAIS, and the question of rigor. Let's start with the notion of activist, community-centered research. Part of this call for activism is the belief in Native American and Indigenous studies that research should benefit the communities that it studies. What if we think about our community as the academic community? I think our energy in humanities-based Native studies might be best spent in academic activism that goes beyond content and instead focuses on methodologies. We need to foster different ways to engage, to engage with the canon we've worked so hard to transform. This means developing curriculum, syllabi, and assignments that ask students to interact with the texts in ways that reflect the origins of those texts. For me, the best way to do that is to assign Indigenous theories and methodologies. The other issue I'd like to discuss is rigor, and this obstacle is, to me, the most serious in our efforts for reconciliation in academia. It's also where reconciliation offers us the best strategy in its commitment to ongoing work grounded in the recognition of past wrongs. There is still, within the academy, resistance to Indigenous research methodologies. This resistance presents problems for graduate students who need to produce a dissertation that will pass a committee, and it presents problems for junior scholars who need to produce research that will lead to tenure. So I'd like us to have a conversation about clearing that rigor hurdle, since we so often hear from dissertation and tenure committees and even journals that an Indigenous approach is not rigorous enough to produce serious scholarship. If we can't reconcile our methods with our content, how can we ask our students to do so? Thank you.